governs almost everything we do, yet few have done more to uncover its influence on human health than our next speaker. It's an honor to introduce Dr. Charles Czeisler, a pioneer whose work has foundationally shaped our understanding of circadian biology and its profound impact on sleep, performance, and safety. As chief of the Division of Sleep and Circadian Disorders at the Harvard Medical School and director of Sleep Matters Initiative, his research has helped redefine how we think about fatigue, risk, and human limits in a 24/7 world. From hospital systems to aviation and beyond, his insights have translated into real-world strategies that protect lives and optimize performance at scale. We're incredibly fortunate to have him here with us today to share his perspective. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome to Dr. Czeisler.
Thank you very much, Dr. Avedon, for that kind introduction. I'm excited to talk with you all today about strategies to optimize health, performance, and safety from the point of view of circadian rhythms and sleep. And really, that's going to focus on brighter days and darker nights. And I'm going to try to convince you that you should, you and your patients should emphasize the importance of exposure to light during the daytime and avoiding exposure to light during the nighttime. This is a painting by Claude Monet of the Rouen Cathedral in the morning, and you can see that the quality of the light and the intensity of the light is quite different than when he painted the same image in the evening, which you can see here also exhibited on the left. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to this work and the work that we have done together is what I'm going to be presenting today. And this has been supported by many organizations, government grants from independent industry sponsors, as well as I've also consulted with a number of these entities as well. So I'm going to bring you back to 324 BC, which was when it was first discovered during the marches of Alexander the Great, that the leaf movements of plants, at least this is the first time that it was ever written down, that the leaf movements of plants varied with the time of day, and that some plants actually folded up their leaves and closed down during the night and opened up during the day when the sun shone. So that's 324 BC, during the marches of Alexander the Great. And it was the tamarind tree that they were actually looking at. Now, it took 2,000 years, nearly 2,000 years, for the endogenous nature of that rhythm to be discovered by a French astronomer who reported that the daily leaf movements of the heliotrope plant was actually not caused, it had been thought that it was the sun coming out during the day that did something to the leaves of the plants and caused them to open up as a response to the change in the environment. And though the change in the environment does have an impact, what de Moran discovered in the 1700s was that this response was not strictly dependent on the light, and that if you kept the plants in a dark closet, so he put the plants in a dark closet and discovered, lo and behold, the next day when he opened the door of the closet, the leaves of the plants had opened up as if they were outside, exposed to the sunlight. And he said that he described that it, quote unquote, feels the sun without seeing it in any way. And he thought maybe this applied to people who were infirm, sick people, and in their confinement were aware of the difference between day and night. But he said that, it's going to take a long time to figure out how this works. But he just wanted to let the botanists know that it was not strictly a response to the sun, but this was endogenous within the plant. It took another 100 years for it to be discovered that the period of these oscillations was not exactly 24 hours. And so, and that was discovered in plants in the 1800s. And this is a graphic in the Flying Squirrel that was published in 1959. And you can see, it was published in 1960, actually, anyway. You can see that every day, the way these data are published, this is the first day, the fifth day, this is the 25th day, and the flying squirrel is active on a running wheel. And you can see that every day in darkness, it is starting to run a little bit earlier. So this is the time of day that it's running on the horizontal axis. And so at the beginning, on the first night of this recording, it's starting to run at, let's say, 1 in the morning. And then by the end of the recording, 25 days later, it's starting to run sometime between 3 and 6 in the evening, probably around 4:30. So this means that the period of this endogenous circadian rhythm of running wheel activity in the flying squirrel is actually shorter than 24 hours. In humans, we can track this by looking at the timing of the release of the hormone melatonin, which signifies the beginning of the biological night. And most people, if they're kept in very dim light, have an intrinsic period of their oscillation that's a little bit longer than 24 hours. These are young men and older men and women. And you can see that most of them have a period that's longer than 24 hours, where each day the timing of the release of melatonin is going later, so that by the end of, in this case, 2 weeks, they're a couple of hours later. But there are a few people, about 25%, that have a shorter than 24-hour period. And so we can look at the distribution here of these intrinsic periods. Now, to our amazement, just as in animals, I mean, it was amazing to see this in people, but this had been shown in animals before, that if you had, in this case, a regular bedtime, because we did keep them on a regular schedule for several weeks before coming in, that the timing of the onset of the release of melatonin varied with the period of the oscillation. So the shorter the period, and remember 25% of them are shorter than 24 hours, the earlier the biological night started. So if somebody's going to bed at 10 p.m. on average, ordinarily we would begin to release the sleep-promoting hormone melatonin a couple of hours beforehand. But in those with a really short period, it might be 4 or 5 hours beforehand, which would be at like 5 or 6 in the evening, just when they're having dinner. And that's problematic because melatonin makes insulin less effective. So it causes insulin resistance, and glucose levels go higher once melatonin is on board, because ordinarily we don't eat during the biological night, and it helps to support brain glucose levels. It's also, individuals here would not be the life of the party. The melatonin only lasts, the biological night only lasts about 10 hours. So if you begin 5 hours before your bedtime, then 5 hours later, these individuals are going to be waking up, and that may be associated with early morning wakefulness. So, and that type of insomnia. That's because the ability to sleep varies profoundly with circadian phase of the melatonin rhythm. So when melatonin is being released, the percentage of time awake is only about 3% of the night, whereas when they're trying to sleep when melatonin levels are not high, the healthy adults are awake 25 to 30% of the time, and that's young people, and older people would be awake half the time, trying to sleep during their biological daytime. Now, it turns out that when we studied a much larger group, and now we're talking about 100 people, that we found, and we began to study many more women in this larger cohort. That so we had over 50 women in this cohort and about 100 men, I believe. What you can see here is that the period of the circadian system in men is slightly longer. It's about 24.2 hours, whereas in women it's about 24.1 hours. There is a spread, but 3 times as many women have a shorter period than 24 hours than do men. And this period of the circadian system is very relevant to our ability to adapt to different day lengths. For example, and these are studies we did for NASA, if we were to go to Mars, which has a 24.65-hour period of its solar day, then unless we do special lighting exposure, most people would be unable to synchronize with the Martian day and would be expressing their own intrinsic period because they would be unable to entrain to the 24 point. It's basically a 39, going to bed 39 minutes later each day. So that's very much further away from the 24-hour period that we normally are synchronized to. So what is the means by which we reset this endogenous circadian rhythm to the 24-hour day? It turns out that that's exposure to light. And we discovered the resetting effect of light in humans in the 1980s. The first report was in 81 and then in 86. And finally, we did a very large study that we published in 89. And we showed that exposure to light that you would get just after dawn or just before dusk outside could reset the circadian system by up to 12 hours in either direction. And that just as it is in other species, the timing of the exposure was critical. So the same exposure given in the middle of the day had no resetting effect. In the middle of the night, it could reset the system by up to 12 hours. And in between, light exposure in the evening reset us to a later hour, and light exposure in the morning reset us to an earlier hour. So it would be like taking a drug that at one time of day increased your blood pressure, at another time of day decreased it, and at yet other times of day had no effect. So the effect of light depends on when we're exposed to the light. And at the time, this was a big deal because it was thought that we were not sensitive to light at all. But, the main focus of this work was really to understand how we could best synchronize the circadian system to the 24-hour day and what was going wrong in most blind people. And we discovered that just like the ear has 2 functions, one is hearing and the other is sight, the eye has 2 functions. Just like the ear has 2 functions, one is hearing and the other is balance. The eye has 2 functions, one is sight and the other is circadian photoreception. And we identified that some people who were totally blind, we could reset their circadian rhythms and even suppress and keep them synchronized to the 24-hour day, as in the case of this individual. Oops. And we could even suppress the release of the hormone melatonin in some people with light that they couldn't see, which was mind-blowing. It took us 5 years to get it published. We submitted it to 20 different journals because they just thought we were crazy. But it turns out that, and this had been understood for 2 centuries, that the ganglion cell layer was not photoreceptive, that was just relaying information to the occipital cortex, and that all the photoreceptors were in the outer segments where the rods and cones were, and that's where the work of perceiving the photons occurred. So light came in, went through the ganglion cell layer, didn't have any photoreceptors there, and then the information came out to the ganglion cell layer. That was how it was thought to work for 2 centuries. But based on our work in blind people, there was a flurry of activity at the basic level that identified that there were a subset of ganglion cells that contained a photopigment, a novel photopigment called melanopsin, that could actually reset circadian rhythms, because the information from those cells did not depend on the rods and cones. And those cells are most sensitive to, we inherited them from marine organisms, and they're most sensitive to exposure to blue enriched light. So if we look at the spectral sensitivity, you see that it peaks at around 481 nanometers. Just published this a few years ago. And this is based on melatonin suppression. We've also done similar things with phase resetting. So that means that the blue enriched light to which we're exposed when we're reading, for example, from an iPad or some sort of smartphone or tablet, has a profound direct effect on these cells that mediate circadian photoreception, that are independent of sight. And so those exposure to light in that wavelength, reading from a light-emitting ebook as opposed to a printed book, suppresses melatonin. And even the next day, you can see that it has elicited a phase shift in these individuals who read from the light-emitting ebook of about an hour and a half as compared to where they were before, and they're more sleepy in the morning, and their circadian rhythms are shifted. And those who read from the printed book the evening before are more alert than those who read from the tablet. Now, the late Professor Richard Cronauer, an oscillator theorist with whom I had the privilege of working for 40 years, this was the last paper that he published before he died, and he was considered his most important paper. And what he discovered in this analysis was that the light exposure during the first few minutes of the exposure had the most profound effect on resetting our circadian rhythms. So, and he quantified this in the resetting rate, the minutes of phase shift per minute of light exposure. So the first 15 seconds of the light exposure, so you turn on the light to go to the restroom, or your patient turns on the light, and they have those, lights that they use to put makeup on, or whatever, in the bathroom. 15 seconds of exposure, the resetting rate is 139 minutes of resetting per minute of light exposure at that time. And then it drops down to 22 minutes of light exposure, of resetting per minute of light exposure for the next couple of minutes. So you can shift yourself by 45 minutes to an hour with just a 2-minute light exposure, which is a bit crazy. But he shows how dramatic the changes. So the way he described this, there are ready elements that are just waiting for the light exposure. And as soon as the signal is received, they go into action and are recruited, leading to this tremendous response at the beginning, which asymptotically declines. And then you're able to continue resetting by the refresh rate at which you're producing those ready elements to initiate phase shifting. So, getting back to Mars for a moment, if we want to adapt to the Martian day successfully, the astronauts living on Mars, they will have to grow their own food, unlike farmers on Earth, who often get up in the early morning to tend to their crops. They'll have to tend to their crops in the evening, because that's going to be the most well-lit part of the habitat on Mars, because the energy is going to be in short supply, but it has to be used to produce food. And going into that area where they'll be farming in the evening would be enough to reset their circadian rhythms, to keep their circadian rhythms synchronized to the Martian day, so that they don't suffer from it wouldn't be non-24-hour disorder, it would be non-24.65-hour disorder upon Mars. Okay, so back on Earth, what have we been doing to ourselves? Well, humans like to be able to control when we're exposed to light, and we have, for the past 700 years, tried to upset the apple cart a little bit and take control of when we're exposed to light, so that we have the ability to turn on the lights when it's dark outside. So at the beginning, that was with candles and things like that. And the price of lighting was very high per each megalumen of light produced. We have gotten more and more clever, and the price of lighting has gone down dramatically. Even since I was a kid, it's gone down by an order of magnitude. And every time it goes down by an order of magnitude, there's an increase by an order of magnitude in the lighting use per capita. And now that we've switched to LED lamps, which are even less expensive to run, since incandescent lamps, 95% of the energy went into heat. That's why you burn yourself on the bulbs. But now the LEDs, almost all the energy goes into producing light, and it becomes more efficient, and energy usage goes up. Lighting usage per capita has gone up dramatically as well. And with this ability to control our exposure to light, many people have adopted, instead of consistent bedtimes and wake times, very irregular schedules in which you would hardly know when it's day or night, and they can control the lighting exposure. And so there's, quote unquote, no reason for them to necessarily go to bed at a particular time of day. In order to quantify this, and Andrew Phillips, working with Will Clerks, developed this sleep regularity index and used it to show, and this was the first paper reporting from the sleep regularity index, that those who were more regular in the timing of their sleeping and waking had light exposure patterns with more light exposure in the morning and less light exposure in the evening, whereas the irregular sleepers had more light exposure in the evening and less light exposure in the morning. And as a consequence, their melatonin secretory patterns were much later in the irregular group than in the regular group. And that meant that the Harvard students in this case were going to bed, their circadian rhythms, when they were in the irregular group, were basically on UCLA time, whereas those in the regular group were on Cambridge, Massachusetts time. And it's no surprise. That would mean that going to a 9 a.m. class would be like 6 a.m. biological time for the irregular sleepers. And it's not shocking that the irregular sleepers didn't do nearly as well academically. So I was interested in sort of going back in time and seeing what it was like in places that didn't have exposure to light. And so we visited Dr. Fernando Luzada was kind enough to take me from Curitiba, Brazil, where he was on the faculty, to a remote area near Adrianopolis, Brazil, which was not yet electrified, didn't have electricity. And so we visited this family, and the 2 parents and 7 children were living all the way from a teenager who was riding the horse here to a babe in arms that the mother was caring for. And they lived in a 1-room home with a dirt floor and no electricity. And I wondered what happened when, the baby woke up at night or whatever. And after the translation back and forth several times, she finally realized the question. And she said, "Oh, we never wake up at night. We go to bed at dusk and we get up at dawn, and we never wake up at night." And late evening light exposure, once these areas are in areas that were electrified, um, was associated with less regular schedules. So no late evening light exposure, the sleep regularity index was higher than in those with late evening light exposure. And after these studies have been done, there have been a lot of follow-up studies, epidemiologic studies, looking at the sleep regularity index and finding that, for example, in many other conditions, major depressive disorder, that those with more irregular schedules have a much higher risk of major depressive disorder, and those with more regular schedules, which is on the horizontal axis here, have a much lower risk of depression. Generalized anxiety disorder, the same thing, with a much higher risk in those with a lower sleep regularity index, meaning that they have more irregular schedule. You can see here there's also an increased risk of the dementia hazard going up more than 50%, and MRI brain volumes decreasing as regularity decreases as well. And this is for a median follow-up of 7.2 years among 88,000 participants in the UK Biobank, who were followed for 1 week, in which they're based on actigraphy, in which their sleep regularity index was calculated. And it's consistent with an association study that was done indicating that sleep variability was associated with cognitive decline in humans, that was done in a different cohort. Now, Dr. Windren and Dr. Burns, Angus Burns, did a study comparing sleep regularity and sleep duration. So these are the regular sleepers here, somewhat irregular here, very irregular here. And you can see that sleep regularity is a greater predictor of mortality. This is the proportion of individuals surviving than over an 8-year, this is 10 million hours of actigraphy, 60,000 individuals, and this is a 7.8-year follow-up interval in the UK Biobank. And again, you can see that in terms of mortality, the effect of irregular schedules, the correlation between irregular schedules and the risk of death is greater than is the correlation between sleep duration. Now, there are interindividual differences in the response to light in the evening. So these are individuals exposed to different intensities of light, 10 lux of light, 30 lux of light, all the way up to 2,000 lux of light. And you can see that the time at which an individual begins to suppress melatonin, dim light melatonin onset, is related to the intensity of the light. So there's more suppression at 30 lux than there is at 10 lux, more suppression at 50 lux to a later hour than there is at 10 lux. And of course, there's much more suppression at 2,000 lux than there is at 50 lux. But there are individual differences, so that here, even at 2,000 lux, 25% of the population is having a dim light melatonin onset that's 2 hours later, whereas some are moved 4 hours later. So, and we don't understand the impact of those inter-individual differences. There's some association between greater sensitivity to light and an increased risk, for example, of delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. So you can imagine that if you are more sensitive to light and you're exposed to evening light and that shifts you more, you're going to be at greater risk for delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. Now, this study I'm mentioning because it's quite amazing that artificial light at night. So now we're switching to a slightly different topic from irregularity, although they are very much related, because when people have irregular sleep-wake schedules, they are more often exposed, as I showed you earlier, to light at a later time of day and less likely to be exposed to morning light at an earlier time of day. So what you can see here is that in this study of 43,000 women, there was an effect of exposure to artificial light at night, even while the individuals were sleeping, on the risk of obesity. So they looked at people who slept with a nightlight compared to individuals who did not have a nightlight. And so compared to individuals without artificial light at night, sleeping with a TV or a light on in the room was associated with gaining 5 kilograms or more. So that's a hazard ratio of 1.17, so a 17% increase. A BMI increase of 10% or more, that's a 13% increase. An incident overweight, 22% increase. And incident obesity, 33% increase over the follow-up period. So, and that's kind of amazing that just sleeping with a nightlight had such a profound effect on these other parameters over a 5.7-year follow-up interval for women who are 35 to 74 years of age. So again, hearkening back to the theme of darker nights and brighter days. So now this is another study using the UK Biobank, and Angus Burns is the first author of this paper. And now we start to get into actual measurements of light exposure at night. And he's now divided the individuals into quartiles. And he's referencing it to the first quartile, which is the quartile receiving which is sort of being viewed as the baseline here. And so now we look at major depressive disorder. As the quartile of light exposure at night, in other words, the fourth quartile is the 25% of people who had the most light exposure at night. And you can see that they were at the highest risk of major depressive disorder. On the other hand, the fourth quartile, the 25% of individuals who got the most light exposure during the daytime were at a 20% decreased risk of developing major depressive disorder. So there's a 50% difference in risk between these two. So a 30% increased risk if they get more light exposure at night, and a 20% decreased risk if they get more light exposure during the daytime. So ideally, to maintain optimal health and safety, you would have, and the lowest risk in this case for depression, but you see it's the same thing for post-traumatic stress disorder, even psychosis, and self-harm. So having more light exposure at night, 30% increased risk of self-harm. Having more light exposure during the daytime, a 20% decreased risk of self-harm over the follow-up period in this study of 85,000 people. Now, I mentioned that in the United States, we've banned the use of incandescent lights, which have a much longer wavelength. And now, since about 2015, most of the light has been replaced with LED lights, which in general are much more blue enriched than incandescent lights, which have a much longer wavelength. The risk of breast cancer, which has been, so night shift work has been classified as a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization since 2007, and that was reaffirmed in 2019. And the primary mechanism is thought to be through light exposure at night. And one of the cancers associated with this is an increased risk in shift workers is breast cancer. And so it's concerning to me that the incidence rate of, it's concerning but not entirely surprising, that as we switched to a shorter wavelength of light in our ambient lighting, which people use more and more at night, that the risk of breast cancer has been spiraling up since that time, as compared to being relatively stable prior to that. And this is the proportion of lighting coming from mostly LED. In 2015, it was 4%, and in 2020, it was at 47%. And the incandescent dropped dramatically during that interval. So, and exposure to the blue enriched light, as I showed you before, suppresses the release of melatonin, which is an oncostatic agent that retards the growth of cancer cells. But it's not just cancer, and it's not just mental health issues that are associated with exposure to light at night. But now, studies in the UK Biobank, and this was just published this past year in October of 2025, you can see here that the highest decile of light exposure, those in the top 10% of being exposed to light at night, have a 30% increased risk of coronary artery disease over the follow-up 8-year interval, and a 47% increased risk of myocardial infarction, 56% increased risk of heart failure, 30% increased risk of atrial fibrillation, and 30% increased risk of stroke. Light exposure during the daytime, on the other hand, those in the top 10 percentile, a 13% reduced risk of coronary artery disease, a 9% reduced risk of myocardial infarction, a 28% decreased risk of heart failure, 7% decreased risk of atrial fibrillation, and 27% decreased risk of stroke. So these findings suggest that avoiding exposure to light at night may lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. And finally, we can look at the increased light at night and decreased light during the day associated with increased mortality. And so this is now both all-cause mortality and cardiometabolic mortality. And what you can see here is that there is so this is the hazard of mortality plotted on the vertical axis. And these are two different models. Model one is adjusted for age, sex, ethnicity, and photoperiod. Photoperiod is the fraction of time that an individual exposed to light every 24 hours. And model three is additionally adjusted for employment status, education, income, physical activity, smoking status, alcohol consumption, urbanicity, and social activity. And what you can see, and here again are individuals in the top 10 percentile of exposure to light. They have a 20 to 30% increase in all-cause mortality and a 50% or so increase in cardiometabolic mortality as compared to those who are in the lowest 10 percentile. Similarly, those getting the most light exposure during the daytime are at a 20 to 25% reduced risk of all-cause mortality and a 20-25% reduced risk of cardiometabolic mortality. Now, and they title their article, Brighter Nights and Darker Days Predict Higher Mortality Risk. And this is, again, a study in 88,000 individuals. Now, this is kind of amazing to me because when we first discovered, 40 years ago, that light could reset circadian rhythms, it was, the debate at that time was it social interaction or was it actually exposure to light at night that induced these changes that could reset circadian rhythms? And it was thought that humans had evolved beyond what was known to, it had been known that light was the primary signal for resetting circadian rhythms in plants and in insects like the Drosophila. And it was thought that as you got higher up on the evolutionary tree, at least from our perspective, higher up, that small mammals, for example, like hamsters, were much less sensitive to light, and it would take much stronger and much brighter light for a longer duration, and that the maximum phase shifts that could be achieved were in the 1 to 2 hour range. And that humans had evolved so far that we were no longer sensitive to light, and only social interaction was what could reset our circadian rhythms. So one of the things that we published in that article in 1989 was that we were just as sensitive to light as the cockroach. So that notion that we had evolved and were no longer as sensitive as other species, we disagreed with, and our findings indicated that we were just as sensitive to light, and that the system for resetting human circadian rhythms shared many of the properties across species, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, because thermoregulation is so different, for example, in plants, which don't thermoregulate at all, as compared to mammals, which are homeotherms, as compared to lizards, which again tend to have the temperature, they're poikilotherms, and they have the temperature of the environment. Well, that's a completely different system than circadian photoreception and the resetting of the circadian system, which shares properties in common between single cellular algae all the way up to human beings in terms of how it is reset by exposure to light. And so that was very exciting to discover, but I didn't really, it had never occurred to me that the impact of light would be so profound that it would increase by that your light exposure, if you've got too much light exposure at night, that it would increase your risk of death over the next 8 years by 30%, or that you could reduce your risk of death by getting more exposure to light during the daytime. So I was excited when Dr. Avedon asked me to talk about what people could do to enhance the synchronization of their circadian rhythms and improve health and safety outcomes based on what we now know of how the circadian system works. So first of all, these placards that Thomas Edison produced to convince people to use electric light, that he plastered all over New York when they opened the first power plant in lower Manhattan, to be able to supply electricity around the clock. And every place they had a light switch, this was the placard next to it, because people were afraid of using electricity for light as opposed to candles or gas. And so he had a statement, like many entrepreneurs, without any evidence. The use of electricity for lighting is in no way harmful to health, nor does it affect the soundness of sleep. Well, that turns out to be wrong on both counts. Light exposure at night, which is of course when people use it most because they don't need it during the daytime as much, is both. It does both affect the soundness of sleep, and it is definitely harmful to health. Not the use of electricity per se, but the exposure to light at night. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Czeisler. This was just a wonderful overview, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions and really a lot of material for discussion. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise and sharing this wealth of knowledge and research distilled into less than 45 minutes. And I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience, which we'll try to entertain right now.